Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here. I am really happy to see everybody gathered here and just want to thank Meg and Eleanor and everybody else on the planning team for bringing us together. And what my little piece this morning is to talk about a new resource that's coming out that I hope will be helpful to everybody in this room, but also I'll explain the link to PPSR, and it's called the Tools of Engagement, and it's a planning tool for conservation, and a number of people in this room have been working on it. And you'll all get a copy, and some of you are going to, oh great, I get to take a heavy thing home, but we'd love to have your feedback. You're going to be the first group to actually have it and hold it and see it. So it is a beta version. It's going to be posted on the web, and I'll tell you more about it. But really happy to have a chance to just talk about this and then see the links between not only this tool, but what we're going to do as a result of this conference. So what I'd like to do is just very briefly, a little bit of thinking behind the toolkit, a little overview of what's in it and what's coming, and then how it does link to the PPSR conference. So why a toolkit? How did this start? So I feel like, and the people that know me in this room know that I've been talking about this toolkit for about 800 years. And it is finally, we have a product. But it started when I was still working at WWF, and a group of us were talking about the role of education in a conservation organization or agency. There were a number of us that got together and really were thinking about how does education fit in a conservation realm, and how does education help lead to conservation outcomes? What do we know? What really works? So a lot of us have been thinking about this for a long time, and we were thinking about education and then broadened it to think about what are all the tools we have, education and other social strategies that can actually help us accomplish our conservation goals? How do we build a stronger conservation constituency? How do we, if we're making some progress, how do we sustain that progress? And thinking about that. And then we were talking about when you look at a lot of how organizations are structured, you'll see the science and policy experts often not together, they're in different places too, but then you see the educators somewhere else, and then you see the communicators somewhere else, and we've really, as I think a field, really been looking at what does integrated conservation really look like, how does it work in organizational structures, and what does it mean for practice on the ground. So we all know that conservation is about people. It's about people doing things that are going to either help or hurt the environment. And when we think about how do we plan a conservation project, as Rick was saying, how are we thinking deliberately about what we're doing? So what's the people part of that? And that's part of what the thinking was in developing this toolkit, which, and I'll tell you in a minute about the open standards, but it starts with thinking about what are you shooting for? What are your conservation targets? What are your biodiversity targets, and what are your human welfare targets? And thinking about what are the threats to those targets? What are the root causes and the behaviors that are causing the threats? Which audiences do you need to reach and why? And what do you know about those audiences? Which messages are going to resonate? What are the strategies you want to use? And what's your theory of change? And trying to think through your process without just jumping ahead to a tactic or thinking about that. We all love to do that, but trying to think about it with a people focus in mind. So that's where the tools of engagement came from, and we had a lot of trouble with the title, just like PPSR. So tools of engagement, the acronym TOE, we didn't really like that, but hey, it's a beta version. But the audience for the toolkit are really all conservation professionals, educators, communicators, project managers, scientists. So the educator side of the realm, the outreach side, really need to think about the conservation side if you're working for an agency or conservation organization, and the scientists or folks that have not come up through the social sciences need to think about the people side. How can we work together and think more deliberately about that? So we did build it on the open standards. And how many of you are familiar with the open standards for the practice of conservation? Okay, a few hands going up. You can check out the open standards, just Google it. The Conservation Measures Partnership is a group that, these are conservation organizations that probably 5 years ago got together and started collecting the best practices of what we know works in conservation planning. And it's an adaptive management process, very common sense, really good stuff there. And there's a software tool called Marathi that some of you might have used, really helpful in thinking through your conservation project. And we're going to be thinking about, so what's the role of PPSR in conservation and in this whole process? But what we wanted to do with the toolkit is take it a little step further and really focus on the people part. In addition to identifying your biodiversity targets, what's the role of engaging people along the way? And initially, we've been funded by the previous Environmental Education and Training Partnership that many in this room are familiar with, and it ended in December last year, and it was a consortium of organizations funded by EPA, and they helped support this, which has been terrific, and it's really been a collaborative project. So Audubon, I was asking Rick, am I allowed to put something that says a bad word up? But Audubon was a lead partner in this. And then we worked very closely with the Fish and Wildlife Service and Janet Adey. Janet, do you just want to raise your hand? Janet and Georgia were really helpful, and together we were trying to take the lead on this. But a bunch of other people have contributed, thought about it, reviewed it. Joe Heimlich, Joe, raise your hand. Joe's involved in every project in the world. I just want you to know that, every single one. Nicole couldn't be here from Stanford, Disney's Animal Kingdom, Jackie Ogden, and Bob Petty, raise your hand, my colleague, who's just been with me every step of the way on trying to get this done. But it's really been a collaborative effort with scientists. Tess Present is our VP of Conservation Planning at Audubon. She was involved of really trying to get scientists, policy folks, educators, communicators to talk together. So very quickly, we did some homework before we put this together, and a number of you were involved in some of those surveys and interviews and literature search, and Joe and Nicole did a lot of that upfront work. We also interviewed CEOs asking why or why not you think about education and what your thinking is about the social strategies, and we collected all that, and we have access to any of that info if anybody's interested. And of course, we pulled from all the great work that's out there. And this is just a really tiny list, but a lot of you are in this room that we pulled from your work, including Martha Monroe and Susan Jacobson, a lot of other folks. And we were looking at all the ways we engage people. We broadened from not just education, because education is critical, but all the ways that we get people involved in our projects. What do we think about? If you're coming from a communication point of view, you're thinking about communication, advocacy, social marketing. And in the toolkit, we're just emphasizing some of the highlights of, if you think about environmental education, why use education? Why think about education as a tool to help us achieve our conservation goals, as well as to achieve your education goals as well? And for something like environmental education in the toolkit, we refer to Martha's book because we don't want to reinvent the wheel, but really thinking about what's different about education and communication. The experiential learning cycle, so critical to how we learn and how we form a new worldview. Critical thinking, Rick was mentioning that, how important critical thinking is in terms of developing environmentally literate citizens, and thinking about that in terms of the work and why we're doing something. But also, you might want to think about social marketing. If you have an action that you really know what it is, how do you get there? How do you get through the barriers? And in the toolkit, we've got some case studies that highlight how education, social marketing, and other social strategies actually do help us get to our conservation goals. And of course, advocacy, and Rick mentioned this as well, there's advocacy on education, on conservation issues, but the tools of advocacy often use education, communication. They all overlap, and the words can get us in trouble because we create silos sometimes in our feeling. So we also wanted to look at what do we know about what it is that makes people take action, all the different things that influence action, and what have we learned from the research that can help us influence our project planning and think about it more deliberately. We really looked at a lot about audiences, which audiences and why. We often talk about the general public, which actually isn't really, when you think about it, that's not an audience. It's really hard to do any targeted anything, messaging, programming, when you group everybody in one giant group. So who's causing the problems that you're working with? Who can influence the people that are actually causing the problems? How much do you know about your audience? How much do you know about what makes them tick? How much do you know about what they care about and what they want to do, what's relevant to them, and what's in it for them if they actually do something different? And then we looked at some of the barriers to engagement, which is a really important part of everything we all do. Why aren't people doing what we want them to do? There's a reason. And there are lots of reasons we all have in terms of barriers to engagement. Actually, I say each of these every day. But when you think about the people part of it, is there are a lot of reasons people don't get engaged, and one of them is they don't see their issue as your issue because we haven't made it relevant, or we're not talking, or we're not forming the relationships that need to happen. And so in the project planning part, really thinking about who's the right audience for you and what your strategy is really important. And we found that that's a really critical part that takes a lot of time, a lot of relationship building, and a lot of thinking, a lot of community assessment. But there are a lot of things that in the planning process you can think about, and then you make decisions and you take a stab at something. We also tried to look at short and long-term strategies. So when you're doing a conservation project or plan, you're often thinking about, we have an immediate emergency tomorrow, how are we going to get there? But where do long-term strategies fit into that thinking? How do you build in, okay, we might want to change societal values. How do you build that into your project planning and thinking about that? And then being able to articulate, what is your theory of change? So if I do this, then this would happen, and then this would happen, and then this would happen, and eventually I would reach my goal. And sometimes we start here, but we don't connect it to where we're actually trying to go. And it's not easy. It's really not easy. And some of the research is a little fuzzy in terms of how to help do that. So this toolkit was actually, we were trying to pull a lot of this together in one place. And so the contents of the toolkit are 20 steps that aren't linear at all because you can't plan going 1, 2, 3, 4. But starting with what you're trying to do and really thinking that through and building on what the open standards have, and then having a section on the people part, the audience, the messaging. And I just wanted to say we worked with Spitfire Strategies, which is a wonderful communications outfit. If you go to spitfirestrategies.com, they've got so many wonderful resources up there about how to think about people taking action, communication strategies. They've got something called the SMART chart. So if you're developing a project and you want to think about your communication strategy, you can download this chart and really think it through. But they helped us a lot in terms of thinking through the messaging and some of the communication strategies. And then we've got some tools in here, and actually tools from a lot of you in this room, including Ed's group, Training Resources Group. How do you facilitate some of this if you guys are doing a training? And again, this is a beta version. We expect to change a lot of this as we go forward, and then there are a lot of resources. And then we're working right now on 4 appendices to the toolkit. So the whole toolkit will be a PDF on a website, but these 4 modules are in the works right now. One is on influencing conservation action, what the research says. So we've been working with Joe and Nicole and Christy Merrick and trying to gather some of the research, often conflict, it doesn't all say the same thing, and trying to say, what's the bottom line for practitioners? Because a lot of my colleagues are not going to read some of the social science research. Can we put the research into a format, it's in a question and answer format, that can help, and then we keep updating. We hope it's a living document. As I mentioned, we have about 20 case studies that we've gathered from around the world of how people have used the social strategies to help achieve conservation goals. And we tried to find case studies where people had actually done some evaluation. And then the third module is on diversity in the conservation movement. Where's Tony? Tony DeFalco's been helping us with that, Marcelo Bonto, Angela Park, of really looking at the issue of diversity in the conservation realm and what does that mean, and some practical thinking about how you can actually increase and think about engaging people of different races, ethnicities, backgrounds in the work and how that actually works. It's a really, I think, going to be a great tool. And then storytelling. Why does storytelling matter to conservation? And we've been working with Michael Margolis and Terrence McNally and others on the value of storytelling to getting your message out and talking about it. So those 4 appendices are in the works. And we really hope this is a useful resource for all of us that are working in PPSR. But also one of the things that we're going to be looking at this conference is a module specifically on the linking of PPSR and conservation, and we'll be working closely with Rick and the American Museum and Meg and Eleanor of what, and all of you, what does make sense at the end of this conference, what will help others who couldn't be here pull all this together.